delight to be here, even if it does seem a little bit like a marriage guidance counselling session for bigamists. Because we three have been bickering away for years, even though we love each other really. So tonight we can get it all off our chests and you can help us with the healing process. But since time is short, I'll get straight to the point. This debate is important because, as we've just heard, the appearance of a farming way of life represents one of the most profound changes in the prehistory of these islands, and it behoves us to construct narratives of the what, how, why, and when of this change that provide the best match for the whole range of evidence at our disposal. In this regard, I salute the brilliant radiocarbon dating work of Professor Whittle, which has transformed our understanding of what happened when, even if it has not given us all the answers we seek, particularly as regards beginnings. Other equally significant advances in our knowledge base have been provided by isotopic analysis of human remains to determine people's diet. This work being spearheaded by Rick Shorting and Mike Richards, who have argued for a rapid cessation of eating fish and other marine products as soon as domesticated plants and animals came on the scene. Further advances have come from the analysis of lipid remains in pottery, telling us about the pot's original contents. This research was initiated by Richard Evershed and carried forward by Lucy Cramp. This both reinforces the isotopic results and has revealed that people were exploiting cattle for their dairy products as well as for their meat from the very beginning of our Neolithic. In formulating my own ideas on the Mesolithic-Neolithic transition, I have drawn on these and on other sources of information about practices, traditions, and beliefs, especially those provided by artifacts, domestic structures, and monuments. I've paid particular attention to the patterning and variability of the earliest versions of Neolithic things and practices, to borrow one of Alasdair's terms, in different regions. So what I propose to do is to present my own take on the how, why, and when of the appearance of the Neolithic. Right. And along the way, I'll address some of the criticisms that my model has attracted. If there's time, I'll explain why I believe that my reading of the evidence is more correct than that of my co-debaters. Although if there isn't time, then it should become clear if or when we start shouting at each other later on. But essentially for me, the process of transformation from this way of life, one based on procuring resources from the wild through foraging, hunting, and fishing, to this way of life, based on producing one's own foodstuffs with all the novel mindsets, traditions, practices, technologies, and styles that went along with it, was not a single or a simple process. In other words, I don't believe Alasdair's model of immigrants landing in Kent and the Thames Valley and spreading out westwards and northwards from there, a model that relies overmuch on the radiocarbon evidence at the expense of other kinds of evidence. Nor do I buy Julian's argument that the indigenous population, having observed their continental neighbours doing that farming thing for some time, suddenly decided on a change of identity around 4000 BC. Instead, I would argue that the transformation involves several strands of Neolithization, spread out in time between around 4300 BC and around 3800, in which the prime movers for this change were small groups of farmers coming from different parts of northern France to different parts of Britain and Ireland. They came for various reasons, and their arrival had various outcomes, some of which were disproportionate to the small numbers of people involved. We are not talking here, folks, about the massive coordinated seaborne invasion, with its rather Ucl-type overtones, that Julian has previously claimed would be necessary to account for the observed changes if one accepts my immigration hypothesis. No, no, no! As for the indigenous inhabitants of Britain and Ireland, they were neither wiped out nor displaced by these incomers, nor indeed were they passive, helpless victims of an inexorable process of change. They were active players who made lifestyle changes and choices in the light of their own experiences, and their reactions form an important part of the story, and I think in this I and Alasdair agree. But what's very clear to me is that we cannot possibly understand our processes of Neolithization without understanding what had been going on the other side of the channel, where people had been farming in France for at least 700 years, or a millennium in some areas. Indeed, the huge delay in the spread of cereal growing and of herding domesticated animals from one side of the channel to the other is one of the enduring peculiarities of the story, and one which I would contend is largely due to the overwhelming insularity of Mesolithic groups in Britain and Ireland after Britain became separated from the continent early in the 6th millennium BC. Despite claims to the contrary, there is no evidence for regular toing and froing across the channel by our Mesolithic communities. And even the newly discovered evidence from the Scilly Isles, which suggests one episode of such contact around 5,500, does not make the picture of regular and in some cases very long-distance interactions that Julian paints in his version of events. Apropos of this, one could pertinently ask, where is the evidence for British or Irish Mesolithic style anything among the contemporary farming groups sur le continent, if these regular interactions had been taking place? Our chums across the channel are indeed looking, but in vain. I'll now run very quickly through the various strands of Neolithization as I see them. I know that many of you will already be familiar with this, so do sing along. For those who aren't, we can provide you with an extensive reading list if you're that desperate. There's no time to go into much detail or to discuss the many caveats and loose ends that remain. You can find those in the literature. The first strand is attested by just 7 bones of domestic cattle found at a late Mesolithic camping site at Ferreter's Cove in southwest Ireland and dating to around 4,300 BC. The cattle must have been imported to Ireland since their wild progenitor, the aurochs, did not exist on that island, and the nearest place from which they could have come at this date is northwest France. But what we have here seems to be a case of a false start for the Neolithic. We have to imagine that a small group of French farmers, too small to constitute a viable critical mass, had arrived in the area with their domesticated animals and plants and attracted the attention of the locals, who were actually not at all impressed by these foreign weirdos and had no desire to emulate their funny ways, but found their exotic animals good to hunt and even better to eat. So hence an early shower for this strand of Neolithization. And as for why anyone should have sailed over from northwest France at this time, it is most unlikely that they had been blown off course while out fishing with a cargo of calves that just happened to be on board. But it may be that these people had actually formed part of the same putative strand of Neolithization as this one, this next one, number 2, which seems to have arrived from the Morbihan area of southeast Brittany at some point between 4,300 and 4,039. And is so far only attested by Breton-style megalithic funerary monuments in the form of closed polygonal chambers and simple passage tombs, and by Breton-style pottery, including this late Castellic-style bowl from Achnacribe on the west coast of Scotland. This strand of Neolithization is found along the Atlantic facade of Britain and Ireland, extending around the coast of the northern half of Ireland to encompass a cemetery at Carramore in County Sligo. These are, I would argue, the earliest megalithic monuments and the earliest pottery in Britain and Ireland, and their ancestry in the Morbihan region of Brittany cannot be gainsaid, despite vigorous efforts to deny this from my 2 colleagues here. What we are seeing is the beginning of a long and complicated history of passage tomb building in these islands, and also the beginning of a long and complex sequence of ceramic development. The building of megalithic monuments and the use of pottery would have been totally alien to the Mesolithic communities who lived in the same general area as these putative immigrants, as you can see here. And given the probably low population density of both of these communities, it's quite possible that the incomers could have coexisted in ignorance of their indigenous neighbours for several generations, if not centuries. However, there is no doubt that the Mesolithic way of life, as seen on Oronsay, did come to an end. People argue the toss as to whether this happened around 4,000 or 3,700, and it may be because the indigenes perceived that farming was a more attractive subsistence strategy, so they chose to buy into this new way of life of their strange neighbours. As to why people should have upped sticks from southeast Brittany and sailed north, we have to understand 2 things. First, there had been a tradition of long-distance sailing during the preceding centuries in the Morbihan, as we know from links across the Bay of Biscay from around 4,500 BC. Secondly, the late 5th millennium was a time of social and ideological upheaval in the Morbihan, where a pre-existing social order based on a kind of theocratic big man system was being replaced by a different, slightly more egalitarian system in which the building of simple passage tombs featured. Unfortunately for us, we don't have any uncontested radiocarbon dates relating to this strand of Neolithization in Britain and Ireland, nor do we have any settlement sites yet, so one priority for future research must be to find things. For dating, we have to rely on the good sequence of dates for the late Castellic phase at Lochmariacair in Brittany. But other people's attempts to dismiss this strand out of hand have been based rather more on a "I don't believe it" basis, and on, I would say, sorry to be rude, on a misunderstanding of the French pottery and of the British pottery sequence than on any firm foundations. I find Alasdair's argument that the megalithic monuments are of such simple form that they could be elaborations of middens wholly unconvincing. Likewise, I don't believe that the radiocarbon dates of between 3,700 and 3,100 BC that Stefan Berg has recently obtained from pins from the Carrowmore tombs actually date the earliest use of these tombs. It's obvious that in such a long-lived cemetery, the tombs were cleared out and reused. The third and fourth strands of Neolithization in my model, the so-called Carinated Bowl Neolithic and the Transmanche West strand, both arguably relate to a build-up of population pressure in the heavily settled Paris basin during the late 5th millennium, which seems to have resulted in some kind of exodus of people in both a northeasterly and a westerly direction. It is this process that we can see in the emergence of the Michelsberg culture in northern France, the Low Countries and Germany, and in the westward spread of the Chassé culture out from the Paris basin. Alasdair Whittle's wonderful Going Over book traces various aspects of this diasporic spread. As these overskilled farmers moved out to the Paris basin to try their luck in other areas, so regional and local styles of pottery emerged, such as the Spierer group in Belgium. Some of these styles show a mixing of Chassé and Michelsberg traditions, and indeed it was one of these Chassé-o-Michelsbergoid local groups in the far north of France which arguably gave rise to what we call our Carinated Bowl Neolithic, while another Chassé-related group in Normandy was probably responsible for the Neolithization of southwest England. There's no time to describe in detail the characteristics of each of these strands, but let's rely on a few snapshot images to refresh our memory of the key features. So the Carinated Bowl Neolithic has pottery that looks like this, and here's also a comparandum from just across the channel at Étaples in the Pas-de-Calais. The first couple of generations built massive long houses like this, in which they could live together until they were sufficiently well established to bud off and live in smaller houses like this. Alasdair and I can argue the toss as to whether they landed from Nord Pas-de-Calais in Kent and spread out from there, or whether we're dealing with a broader diaspora directly from northern France, perhaps lasting several generations. These people brought over precious community heirlooms, these jadeite axe heads from the North Italian Alps, some of which would have been centuries old when they were deposited, often in watery environments. Inspired by these settlers sought out mountains as their special places from which to make new stone axe heads, such as here at Great Langdale. And they also networked with each other, exchanging materials such as fine flint, stone axe heads, and pitchstone. With the exception of the odd megalithic tombs in the Medway Valley, they buried their dead in non-megalithic monuments, usually featuring timber mortuary structures, some then covered by long mounds, others by round mounds a little later. And they also used freestanding long rectangular mortuary enclosures. After a little while, in some areas, they translated their timber mortuary monuments into stone versions, as we can see here. And, just as they had done on the continent, they grew cereals in fields, herded cattle, sheep, goats and pigs, and also exploited wild resources, but not seemingly fish or marine mammals. In some areas, once a critical mass of farming communities had become established, they revived their tradition of building large causewayed enclosures as their centres for interactions and ceremonies. It seems that the local Mesolithic communities deliberately chose to acculturate themselves into this lifestyle, perceiving, rightly or wrongly, that farming offered a more reliable all-year-round supply of food. So, that's the carinated bowl Neolithic in a nutshell, or a pot. As for the Transmanche West settlers who went from Normandy to southwest England, we're probably looking at a smaller scale movement than with the carinated bowl Neolithic strand. They introduced a slightly different style of pottery, the forerunner of the southwestern or Hembry style, which is comparable to elements of Middle Neolithic II pottery in Normandy. And they built closed chambers and simple passage tombs, like the ones in Normandy and the Channel Islands, many of them in dry stone walling, as in the case of the so-called Rotunda monuments in the Cotswolds. Here is the semi-megalithic simple passage tomb at Broadsands in Devon. The alpine jadetite axe heads that have been found in southwest England, including this one found beside the Sweet Track in the Sunset Levels, were probably brought over by these people. And it's clear that the descendants of these settlers maintained or renewed their links with northwest France over the following generations. Why they came over when they did was linked to the upheavals in Normandy around 3800 BC, as documented by Cyril Marcigny, that saw a shift there to living in defensive hilltop settlements, among other changes. So that, in another nutshell, is a Transmanche West strand. What I find very interesting is that the second model that Alasdair put forward in his Gathering Time book, his more speculative interpretative model, seems much closer to my multi-strand model than does his ex-Kent Lux version. So perhaps we're more in accord with each other than we think, and I think that's probably a good place to stop and hand over to Alasdair.
Alasdair actually has a few minutes to gather his thoughts together because we move on to Julian Phillips next. Thank you very much.
Right. Over the past century, views of the Neolithic transition in Britain have shifted back and forth between the migration of continental agriculturalists and the indigenous adoption of domesticates and new forms of material culture. So people like Gordon Childe, for instance, actually proposed each of these different interpretations at different stages in his career. Now, it's beyond question that domesticated plants and animals, ceramics, new stone tool types, and new architectural forms were all introduced to Britain from the continent. Without a Neolithic presence, the other side of the Channel, there would have been no British Neolithic. But the means by which new things and practices arrived in these islands still remains unclear. The evidence of material culture is ambiguous. Individual pottery vessels are often uncannily similar on either side of the Channel, but this is rarely the case for entire assemblages. Many of the vessel forms of the Mittelberg and Chassagne are absent in Britain, where a restricted range of shapes prevails, with carinated bowls dominating, particularly amongst the earliest assemblages. So, if these pots were being brought over by continental migrants, we have to explain why they left much of their assemblage at home. This most pertinently applies to the Pas de Calais, at one stage hypothesised as the homeland of the carinated bowl Neolithic, but now rapidly filling out with assemblages of the Spear group, amongst which carinated bowls are only a very minor element. Much the same is true of stone tools. Only leaf-shaped arrowheads were adopted in Britain from the plurality of continental projectile points. This suggests to me a deliberate appropriation of a narrow range of artefacts that unambiguously signify a Neolithic identity, similar to the process on the Dutch sandy soils, where indigenous people adopted a narrow range of vessel forms drawn from Michelsburg assemblage. Equally, The earliest monumental structures in Britain are diverse, suggesting connections with a whole range of different European regions. Sometimes constructional devices from different traditions are combined, and structures are mixed with unfamiliar artefactual assemblages. Arguments that early megalithic tombs on the west of Britain, as we've just heard, are so far unsupported by radiocarbon dates. And one of the many insights from Alasdair and colleagues' outstanding dating work is that just because two monuments look similar, we can't assume that they're contemporary. British monuments may be more recent than their continental prototypes, and the evidence emerging from Ireland raises the possibility that passage tombs were no earlier than the mainstream of Neolithic culture. So, the cultural processes at the beginning of the British Neolithic were ones of filtering, emulation, selection, and recombination. As Alison quite rightly says, the process of Neolithization in Britain was multi-stranded, but I suggest that these strands were braided and intertwined from the beginning. This suggests to me not a simple cross-channel transfer of people and things, but a series of overlapping networks of interaction. However, similarities and differences in material culture will only get us so far. And if we want to move the debate on, we need much more robust models of the social and economic processes that were going on at the beginning of the Neolithic. And this, I think, means that we need to go back to first principles and ask questions like, well, what exactly is or was the Neolithic? Traditionally, that Neolithic is seen as synonymous with agriculture, but I think for a whole series of reasons that's inadequate. There were, for instance, Neolithic communities, like the Pittenweer groups of the Baltic, who made very little use of domesticates. So my answer is to say that the Neolithic was to agriculture as capitalism is to industrial production, where farming is a system of management of plants and animals. The Neolithic was a mode of social organisation, which facilitated that management. While the extent of a community's investment in agriculture might vary, becoming socially and culturally Neolithic was all or nothing. And as John Robb has recently argued, it was much easier to get into the Neolithic than to extract yourself and get out of it. So once you become part of a Neolithic community, it's very difficult to go back to being Mesolithic. Not all Neolithic people were farmers, but conversely, hunter-gatherers would have struggled to maintain fields and herds without undergoing some form of fundamental change. By that I mean becoming Neolithic. So, what makes a Neolithic society? Firstly, it's a bounded community that shares exclusive rights to a body of collective wealth. And secondly, it's what we might call a heterogeneous assemblage, a bringing together and mixing up of humans and a whole series of other non-human agencies. So to a much greater extent than in hunting societies, animals and things become integral to the social fabric, where hunters and gatherers make themselves at home in a world of natural places and carry the minimum of material equipment. Neolithic people inhabited an environment in which architecture and artifacts provide the scaffolding for everyday life. Increasingly, human actions were channeled through, sustained by, and delegated to non-human entities. In the case of the primary British Neolithic, screens and facades structured social interactions. Trackways laid down patterns of movement. Flint mines regulated the production of valuable items. Pottery established the conditions for the preparation and serving of food, and stone axes created social relationships in the practice of gift-giving and clarified social identities in public. Walking around with an axe says you're a particular kind of person. Now, all of this means that where hunter-gatherers have to constantly renegotiate social relationships, much more of everyday life now became habitual and unconsidered, guided by material things. And at the same time, because Neolithic societies were composed of a wider range of entities, they became much more durable. Objects and architecture endured beyond individual human lifetimes, while herds of animals and cultivation plots had temporal dynamics of their own. When you bring all those different temporalities, when you bundle and split them together, the effect is greater stability, and this reduces the possibility of fishing. And all of that helps to create the conditions under which you can engage in agricultural activities. Neolithic societies proliferated across Europe in a patchwork of localised processes. But I think we can note some directional trends. The Neolithic that was established in Greece, largely by population movement, was essentially horticultural. Small, long-lived garden plots of cereals and pulses were manured and the stubble nibbled by small numbers of animals, largely sheep and goats. But over space and time, the centre of gravity of economic practice shifted towards livestock, so that large herds of cattle are indicated in Atlantic France. This process was promoted first by the development of dairying, that we've already heard mention of, and second, by the emergence of lactose tolerance. Now, the most important point here is that what we're seeing is a shift from a subsistence economy, something that basically just keeps you alive, to a wealth economy. Cattle represent mobile capital that can be deployed as feasts, as bride wealth or dowry, as gifts to secure alliances, or as loans to acquire clients. So while any respected hunter-gatherer might have looked askance at the idea of taking up a diet of gruel and lentils, the combination of wealth, power and meat might have been an inducement to indigenous people either to attach themselves to existing Neolithic groups or to collectively undergo social transformation. And that's the kind of process that I think is going on in Britain, this transformation to a different kind of society. So, in the areas of dense Mesolithic settlement around the northwest fringes of Europe, I think we can imagine a growing tension between the siren call of a new way of life and the established norms of social equality and universal sharing. Now, the earliest Neolithic in Britain, I suggest, gives evidence of that kind of process of social transformation. As Neolithic things and practices spread north and west, the construction of large timber halls followed in their wake, not, I suggest, the homes of colonists, but a process of consolidation after a generation or two. These structures were rarely replaced, and many were quite short-lived, sometimes being deliberately destroyed by fire. Their creation may have been as important as their use. They represent a distinct phase in which bounded corporate social groups were being formed, and in which the physical construction of a house provided the mechanism for the bringing into being of house societies. A similar theme of the inauguration of community is hinted at amongst long barrows and long cairns, where relatively short-lived mortuary practices suggest not some kind of cemetery or vault built up over a long period of time, but the creation of a discrete group of founding ancestors from whom the descent of a particular group of people could be now claimed. The construction of halls coincided with what may be a relatively brief enthusiasm for cereal growing. The residence of some, if not all, members of communities at these buildings may have facilitated intensive horticulture, including manuring. In both Britain and Ireland, the subsequent decline of cultivation has recently been interpreted in terms of a boom and bust of pioneering agriculture. But I think that the problem with this argument is that the supposed bust actually coincides with an increase in monument building. Causeway enclosures and enclosures monuments in Britain and passage tunes in Ireland. Now this makes the idea, I think, about a decline in population quite unlikely. And while declining yields may have provided a push factor, I think it's more likely that the pull of a livestock-based wealth economy was more significant. So, following an experimental period after the initial introduction of domesticates, I think what we're seeing is the emergence of larger, more competitive, more violent social formations based on the big cattle herds and interregional exchange networks that are both represented at our course-reading closes. To conclude then, although I'm presenting the beginning of the Neolithic in Britain as a transformation of an indigenous society, I don't wish to suggest that population movement had no part in the process. Simply, I don't think that it was actually the cause. Agriculturalists colonising unknown temperate landscapes by sea face formidable challenges, and it's actually more difficult for agriculturalists to colonise unknown landscapes than hunter-gatherers. As Dennis Blanton points out, even with their formidable advantages, the initial European colonists of the New World often died out in the first winter. So, pitching up on the coast of Scotland with meagre supplies and no knowledge of landfalls, prevailing winds, currents, soil conditions and rainfall would not have been something to undertake lightly. There is quite limited evidence for population pressure or resource depletion driving continental people to the sea. And I think arguments far too often default to a kind of vitalist position which says expanding is what Neolithic people did, so that's what they did. On the other hand, it may be that archaeology focuses too much on collective folk movement and too little on the kind of migration which we ourselves are most familiar with, the movement of people individually or in small groups between established communities. This often happens because people with particular skills and capacities perceive opportunities created by changing circumstances, like Polish plumbers. It's worth considering whether the Neolithicization of British societies created the conditions under which continental potters, miners, herders and cultivators might achieve social advantage by joining communities hungry for innovation. This kind of filtering in by assimilation and marriage perhaps represents one of the means by which practices and skills, as well as just things, were gradually accumulated within societies in transformation. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Julian. Our third contender is Professor Alasdair Whittle, whose work has been referred to by both the first two speakers, particularly his work, of course, recently on dating.
Good. Right. Well, here we see little thumbnail sketches of 4 recent models. We shouldn't neglect, or I don't agree with it, the Collard et al. Model. You've heard 2 of these already, and I should stress also at the outset in my talk that I'm kind of spokesman for what was a very big group. Alex Bayliss isn't here, Francis Healy is, Philip Dixon I've seen, and there may be others who contributed to the great enterprise that appeared as Gathering Time. You might see this as the sort of compromise position, because what we argue for in that volume is actually draws on both the sort of ideas that we heard so far, the ideas of migration, but also the strong involvement of indigenous communities. I suppose what's distinctive about our position, if you can bear it one more time, this is published in extensive detail, it's been out for a couple of years, is that we were able for the first time in a formal chronological framework to set out the time scale in an explicit, quantified, probabilistic fashion. And when we do that, this is what resulted, a pattern which is broadly southeast to northwest, beginning in the southeast of the country, probably has to be stressed many times, but I won't repeat it, because it gets a bit boring. In the 41st century count BC, the Greater Thames Estuary, and then spreading at a varying tempo, an accelerating tempo, in the succeeding centuries. This is, as Alison has already noted, a sort of freehand version in our last chapter, but based on very rigorous analysis. And here is the sum of that rigorous regional analysis. It's also worth pointing out that this is very much a provisional model, and as my initial heading said, maybe all the models are so far deficient, and that's pretty much my theme. I'm going to sort of think about future-proofing this whole debate and problem. What we actually did was to start with some 400 existing radiocarbon dates for causal enclosures, commission and get another 400 plus new dates, and that established a very clear date for causal enclosures, beginning probably in the late 38th century KBC, just before 3700. So this established, fixed in a part of what had previously been a broader span where everything was put together. At the same time, we rounded up another 1400 or so radiocarbon dates for southern Britain, for Ireland, and for Scotland up to the Red Glens, you see mapped here, and that's the basis of the mapping that results with this strongly time-transgressive pattern. And this is the provisional, that was the provisional pattern. We can add to that now. This is the work in her PhD of Sarah Griffiths, who Alex Bayliss and I had the pleasure of supervising in Cardiff, and she's here, and I hope she'll contribute to the debate later on. You won't have time to see all the numbers, but this is broadly conformable with the gathering time picture, but there are some interesting variations. Holbeck Park there, up near Barrow-in-Furness, based on short life material, is a little bit earlier, so we don't necessarily have to argue for a neat Cavalli-Sforza and Amman sort of rolling, very uniform wave of advance. I would argue also that the results coming out of the Cultivating Societies project of Nicky Whitehouse and colleagues, just published, is also conformable with this. This is a representation of their supposed early Neolithic 1 phase, but it actually seems in detail very little to go in it once you strip out the possibly residual dates. And in both these cases, what remains here might also not be relevant to the Neolithic, because it might actually be material that's in association with Mesolithic artifacts. We can look forward also to results from other ongoing projects, the Stepping Stones project of Duncan Garrow and others, and in a new project that Alex and I and others, Francis, moved on to, funded by the ERC, the Times of Their Lives project. We're taking a close look at the dating of pollen diagrams for England. So there's more to add to this. What we have in front of us so far is very much provisional. Sarah's got new data as well. But I think what we've shown, perhaps the single most important thing to underline, is that rather than previously, where the majority of people would say that the Meso-Neo transition was to be fought over around a date of about 4000 BC, we're looking at a much, much longer process. I mean, in part, Alison is an honourable exception to that. So I want to stress the fact that the process of becoming Neolithic and changing, it's dangerous perhaps to use these essentialized terms still, like M and N, Mesolithic and Neolithic. These are processes played out over quite long periods of time. Had I longer, I could take you into the sequence. We think there's very often a gap before the first monuments appear, then long barrows appear, and then enclosures, and so on and so forth. Well, at this point, just to cheer Alison up and to keep the west of things in view, I wonder if you can recognise that in this wonderful picture by the wonderful Norman Ackroyd, Ben Bulben, the foot of the Glens in Leitrim. And I'm going to kind of exploit the symbolism of the light and shade here. We'll be talking about the light. I want to kind of peer into the dark and peer into the future. And this quote from a Muller, roughly translated, is about all this at a European scale. Roughly translated means, was this the old folks, the descendants of the old folks, or was it new folks? But this isn't nice Johannes Muller, the current professor in Kiel. It's Sophus Muller, writing at the end of the 19th century. So I wanted to use this occasion to look ahead and to think about how we could begin perhaps to get better at this long-running debate, resolve some of its issues. And I offer you with a short time available, so I lost all track of time, so I'll just keep going. till you stop me. Offer you 6, and obviously lots more things than I have time to talk about, just very briefly, 6 suggestions. 1, we need to go on keeping a very close eye on the adjacent continent. Here, and thanks to Anthony Denaire and Philippe Crombet for these slides. Here's a representation of what's going on somewhere in the late 5th millennium, but there's a challenge there for continental colleagues to get this all much better dated. We looked more closely, thanks to Philippe, at the sandy lowlands of Belgium. We can see an expansion of settlement. These dots scattered around the different zones are the Michelsberg settlement, corresponding to the other slide here. And we make an argument in Gathering Time for there being some sort of small-scale, filtered colonisation, maybe fairly low-key, maybe no big deal in regional terms, but obviously with potentially profound, as it turns out, consequences in the case of Britain and Ireland, to kick things off at a particular moment of change on the adjacent continent. And of course, in drawing attention to this area, I'm not in any sense saying that we should neglect other areas, which would obviously be not very helpful and self-defeating. Secondly, we need a lot more information on what comes before in Britain and Ireland. This is a picture of a younger version of myself, helping Derek Upton and Stephen Aldhouse-Green with the initial discovery of late Mesolithic footprints in wet levels in southeast Wales. This looks like sort of the last run heading out to sea, having turned the lights on. There's loads and loads of good work, both theoretical and regional and site-based on the Mesolithic. Things have come on a lot over the last 10 to 15 years, but it still remains extremely difficult, for example, to get an idea of what's going on in the lowlands and in the south of the country, especially in the second half of the 5th millennium BC. Gathering Time has shown that you can do this sort of thing. We need a sort of century, half century by half century account of what's going on, I think, before we can be really confident about the kind of narratives we construct. So there's a plea for, I was thinking maybe all Neolithic specialists should be sent off to the Mesolithic for 5 years or so. That might actually help to generate the kind of new data that we need. Thirdly, despite the scale of Gathering Time, there is loads more still to date all over the UK and Ireland. The emphasis, obviously, in Gathering Time has tended to be on monuments. And of course, there's still lots of monuments to date. Our pilot study of long barrows actually only closely dated 5 long barrows, a few more coming along since, but there's an enormous target there, and that's important not only for our understanding of monuments and their contribution to the transformation of society that Julian talked about, but also our understanding of conditions of when they come in many, in fact, nearly all regions. We think there's a gap of some time between the initial establishment of Neolithic settlement, new things and practices, and the appearance of public architectures of the varied kinds that we call monuments. But the same call is also appropriate, especially for the domains of settlement and subsistence. We can't offer any sort of century by century, to say nothing but anything better, a narrative of what's going on in the settlement sphere. Perhaps our work in Pollen, in England, in the times of the Alliance projects will help on that. Thanks, by the way, to Alan Sandler for the Hazelton, of course, and the White Horse Stone, a very early house in Kent. Fourth point is a bit of a grab bag, but it's based around materiality and contexts. We need to keep a very close eye on materiality and context. Project Jade, which Alison was closely involved with, has had a fantastic impact. I think we need to re-energise, at least disrespectful to the appropriate specialists, stone axe studies in this country in the wake of it. I'm surprised that there have never been cross-channel, proper, detailed cross-channel ceramic projects, rightly lots of people, Julian included this evening, have pointed out the selection involved. What about the technological aspects? What about the detailed dating? There's enormous scope for that sort of thing. Karen Moore, I'm afraid we're going to have to differ here. We'll perhaps carry out our fisticuffs in private later. I think that the recent dating by Stefan Berg and Robert Henze gives us a very different picture. If there is older material, where is it? Show us. And then we can start to show its presence in cleared out deposits. Alison didn't mention Machra Boy, but this is the enclosure in Western Ireland just outside Sligo, which has earlier dates, which poses a fundamental problem for the dating of the early Neolithic in Ireland as a whole, because taken face value, it sits just after 4000 Cal BC, whereas the whole of the weight of the rest of the Irish evidence, depending how you model it, belongs, or seems to begin at either 3800, broadly speaking, or 3750. And it's perhaps not enough, as Nicky Whitehouse et al. In a recent publication attempt to do, just to point to the short life samples, which take it later. There are single entity, short-lived charcoal samples in there, which give this big puzzle. So that's something that needs to be sorted. The original excavator, Ed Danaher, we hope is going to take up cudgels again there. And it's one of a whole list of things that need worrying about still. Here's our friend Achnabree Begg. Intriguing idea that there could be connections with Brittany, but I would prefer, as suggested also on slide, has been suggested by Guillaume Robin in a very good recent thesis on its publication as L'Architecture des Signes, to refer this to later pottery traditions. Here he's comparing Ballincollig Court tomb and Vicky Cummings, I'm told, but I haven't actually seen the evidence myself, as something not dissimilar from a court cairn on Kintyre on the peninsula. There's Kintyre here. So I think this is something that belongs later, and so those arguments for the West is potentially very, very interesting, intriguing, never say never, but I don't see the same sort of narrative as Alison does. So there's a big collective effort there to go on worrying about all these things. Fifthly, I think we also need to more theoretical labour on reintegrating economy and society and worldviews. There's been too much separation in a lot of the debate, so that the Neolithic is driven by economy or population or some sort of set of ideas. We need to, as Julian's perhaps hinted in his talk, work harder at modelling things, but also in a very grounded way. There's a lot of work still to be done. There has been some preliminary work on the DNA, for example, of pigs and cattle, work that's been carried out by Gregor Larson and others, by Dan Bradley, by Carrigan and Edwards. There's been a recent paper, not about Britain and Ireland, but about the possibility on the basis of genetic evidence for domesticating pigs in Mesolithic contexts in Europe. So we need to be alert to this and promote this kind of research and get the geneticists asking the right sorts of questions. And thirdly, sixthly, and finally, the organisers are glad to hear, sixthly and finally, it's very surprising and kind of symptomatic that neither of the other two mentioned this. Is it not time, some of you may quake, for some analysis of the human DNA, the ancient DNA evidence? It seems to me very sensible. I hear some talk, perhaps we'll hear in the debate, of some London-based UCL or King's or something. UCL, thank you. Well, I hope you will tell us more about that in due course. Because I think this is potentially very important. All sorts of other scientific analysis hasn't been carried out, but could be. There's a PhD at Durham being carried out by Samantha O'Neill under the guidance of Chris Scarr on strontium and oxygen isotope analyses for a lot of early Neolithic human bone assemblages, and we probably need to move on from bulk collagen isotopic dietary analysis to come to specific, much more detailed analyses. So there's a lot to be done. This slide was published last year by Brandt et al. It's work based in Central Europe. Long and complicated stories, and it's quite controversial because you could easily be dragged back into very sort of old-style mass migrations happening right through the European Neolithic and beyond. What's particularly interesting here is at the beginning, where with the appearance of the linear band ceramic, or the first Neolithic in large parts of Central Europe, there seems to be very much a dominance of new sets of genetic mutations or haplotypes or haplogroups, these various numbers here, and very small numbers of haplotypes and haplogroups which are referable to indigenous hunter-gatherers. Now there are all sorts of complications here, and it may be a good thing in some ways that this hasn't yet been applied. We've escaped some of the earlier mistakes, and you have to be very careful how you interpret this sort of data, because it's clear that a genetic signature does not have to be anything to do with your cultural makeup. I mean, just look around you, especially in London. So we have to be careful with this, but it seems to me odd that this hasn't happened before. It's underway now in UCL, terrific. I don't know if there's anything yet to report. So that and other things I think are going to be the way ahead. Maybe the RAI has this debate again in another 10 years or so. If some of these things have happened, maybe we'll start to see the deficiencies in all the current models and get a little bit closer to really what's going on, especially the sequence of things right through a long narrative. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. We now have time for some discussion and debate. One of the problems of the debate we discovered last time is that contributions as such from the floor don't get picked up by the microphones, and very many people in the audience can't pick them up. Now, we just had what you might call, normally one would refer to it as a duel between two people. We've actually had a trial between three people, and Alasdair has indicated that he, as in the duel, would quite like to call up at least 1 second in the shape of Sarah Griffiths. And I'd just like to ask whether either of the other two would like to choose a second to support the debate. Because we are getting quite difficult, as I say, in picking up contributions from further back otherwise. So do you want to nominate anyone out of the blue by any chance?
I think my model is robust enough not to need a second.
Okay, so questions then, and who would like to start the ball rolling? And as I say, it is difficult. I've been given this microphone, and I have no idea whether it's going to work or not.
We've heard a lot about farming this evening. It seems to me it may be worthwhile distinguishing between arable farming and pastoral farming. And it seems to me there's no particular reason why we should think that they're introduced at the same time.
All the evidence suggests that they were, and indeed the variability in the living structures is such that we can argue that there was transhumance from an early stage. So at Archetegan in Argyll, there is what's effectively a transhumance hut, quite high up, with a pot that is the closest we've got to a Michel'sburg pot.
I'd add to that. I think that's a really good point, because we are certainly seeing both of those things happening. But what is really interesting, I think, is the degree to which either of those is happening at any particular time. And there is a tendency, I think, to have a model of mixed farming who puts the two together and says there's always this fixed relationship between the two. I think what's really interesting is how the two are shifting in relation to each other over time.
I'll be brief, David. I promise I will. Just very quickly on the Ucl project, it's starting this month, and we have an advisory panel that includes archaeologists as well as geneticists, very important, but no results as yet. We haven't even appointed the assistants to go out and gather the initial data. My question, though, is on a different issue, but it's perhaps to follow up on what Alasdair said. Would the other two like to set out their stall to say what should we do to resolve this debate? Where should we go in terms of further investigations?
Well, I agree very much with what Alasdair was saying and the points that he was making and the points that I would make if I'd had the time to say that. I'd like to ask you on the DNA front, theoretically, if people were coming from northern France and northwest France, are they genetically sufficiently different from people who have lived here for the previous 4,000 years to be identifiable? So is it a starter?
So more than just no.
Yes. I think the issue that may be more interesting is whether your notion about Breton arrivals. If we're going to see populations that have effectively got an ancestry back through Iberia into the Mediterranean, those might be more easily distinguishable than those that have a North European sort of via LBK back to the Near East ancestry. The one thing my geneticist colleagues do keep saying, though, is that every study they've done of Mesolithic hunter-gatherer ancient DNA from the European mainland, they all seem to be very different from any subsequent Neolithic. So they can get quite strident about talking about population replacement within Central Europe, within the European mainland. So of course it's whether we're going to find similar results when we look at British material or not.
And I think one of the things that has been so very frustrating is that we do not have human remains that we can point to and say these are the first generation. And it's just a quick of fate. So either they have been unburnt bodies that have disappeared altogether, or they have been cremated. And Achnepriebe, no bones. And it's so frustrating. And I think it's frustrating because no dates mean that it can't get Bayesian modelled. So I think it's got left out. And while I'm here, I'm so frustrated about what you were saying about the pottery. I was going to have, in my 1985 PhD, I have given you the sort of family tree of that particular strand of pottery. And what you're getting at Sabana Caldra is the sort of grandchild of Achnepriebe. And also, the Prehistoric Society, twinned with the SPF in France, we are going to have one of these international pottery things because Vincent R and Hélène Pioffet are dead keen to do it. The only question is, where will we do it? In England, in France, on the ferry?
Just to add, that question about Achnepriebe and of single passage tombs in general, we've got to dig somewhere. No, that's the only way. There are 3-4 different models of what the Neolithics like at its beginning. There are clear things that you can point to and say, if it's this, then this, if it's this, then that. So let's get some dates and just look at passage terms. And I think going back to what you're saying about genetics, let us also have some quite sophisticated models to put alongside the results that we're getting. Because if you think about it, Alasdair's putting forward one idea for what's happening at the very beginning of the Neolithic, and I'm putting forward a different one. The genetics of those two processes might be very, very similar indeed. The difference between what we're saying is, I'm saying you have established societies into which people are filtering. He's saying you have the establishment of a Neolithic society which then draws in indigenous people. Well, how do you set up a genetic model that deals with things that are so similar in terms of their potential genetic outcomes?
This is like that comedy show, and they have to rush. Let's joke. May I say something now? I mean, how about this as a radical thought? In a sense, but only in a sense, because it will shock you, the Mesolithic Neolithic transition doesn't matter because it essentially doesn't work. We're looking for longer narrative. That's not to say we need to revert to the broad brush, fuzzy kind of prehistory that we've all been habituated to. No, we should go on starting into very detailed, very precise chronologies, and we can do that. And we can beat patterns on the calibration curve if there's enough associated evidence, stratigraphic or from seriation or typology. But was it X amount of small scale, rather disrupted colonists at a particular moment, or over a series of episodes, or in your analogy, no disrespect to anyone from Eastern European and Polish plumbers, or some sort of mix? Does this really matter? What matters is the longer term narrative of transformation. I mean, it'd be great to know when there are precise episodes that kick things off. It'd be very interesting if it's doable to get genetic discrimination, but it's that living and changing. Julian talked about sort of durability in Neolithic society, but I think one of the big messages that we would say from a gathering time perspective is of the changeability, the accelerating tempo of change through these first centuries. It'd be wonderful to get more detailed insight into what is also going on in the last centuries of the Mesolithic, especially, we believe, in southern Britain, but not only in southern Britain, of course.
The trick with this appears to be to keep it within about an inch of your mouth if you want to ask a question. If you're prepared to do that, Andrew, I'll take your question.
Did you want to? Did you put your hand? You put your hand.
I'd just like to ask one question and make one suggestion. My question is, are there any sites that do show a transition which are half Mesolithic and half Neolithic? As far as I know, all the sites are Neolithic. And my suggestion is that you should have an East Island in the Pacific, because there you get an example of a migration, presumably a single migration happening. You don't actually see the results for at least 200 years, and when it is, it's quite different from the places it presumably came from. And perhaps, are you not wanting to break an example, to break correspondence between France and England, and it is very much more vague?
You have Fir Tree Field Pit, which has a sequence that includes late Mesolithic and very early Neolithic. There is a site in Ireland that I'm toying to remember the name. It's a wooden platform in the wetlands in the Midlands, which is kind of ostensibly a kind of hunting-gathering type of place, but it has domestic cattle there, it's got pottery there. You also have domesticated animals in shell middens, particularly in Ireland. But also you get sites where there is Mesolithic material and there's Neolithic material. So at Gleckner Bay on Bute. But the problem with that is that we've dated both, and there is a good 1,000 years between the two.
I think hunting for men. Oh, I'm Sarah Willis. I used to be Prof Whittle's PhD student. I think hunting for sites that exhibit predetermined transition moments is probably a complete misnomer, because searching for some elusive aspect in the archaeological record isn't particularly helpful. I wanted to talk about some of the sites in Yorkshire that show chronological overlap between late Mesolithic and early Neolithic activity. And I think, so perhaps equally radically, I think that using preconceived concepts of the Mesolithic or the Neolithic is also a misnomer. Perhaps we should be talking about Neolithic and Mesolithic types of activity and styles of material culture, and using it as an adjective instead of a kind of pristine archaeological concept. So these sites in Yorkshire are chronologically, people are doing Mesolithic type things in the uplands at the same time as people are doing Neolithic type things in the lowlands. And that's maybe as close to transition, to a moment of transition as we're ever going to get.
Next question from the Secretary then.
I wanted to quiz Alison somewhat about her statement that there's evidence of insularity in the Mesolithic groups, late Mesolithic groups. Because I would say that I find that very worrying, because the evidence that we do have for late Mesolithic activity suggests actually that people are very far-ranging in terms of where they're getting the raw materials from. They can be travelling over quite large distances. And I find it implausible that they weren't moving around seaways as well. And isn't it just a matter of choice that they don't, they're not interested or people aren't coming over here? It's not a matter of the fact that there isn't any contact. There's just no evidence of contact.
In terms of the sort of global insularity, there is a very strong emphasis on this. For example, Irish late Mesolithics are particularly distinctive lithic assemblage. They're completely different from anything that you see in England and Scotland. The only place that's remotely similar is the Isle of Man. And it's been argued that particular assemblage developed because of the range of natural resources that were being exploited. Sure, people were moving around, and we know that in Oronsay you can trace that they're going to Jura, they're going to the mainland. They weren't going to the Morbihan area of Brittany. Whereas in the Morbihan area of Brittany, you have several centuries worth of evidence for people who have got into boats and have gone long distances and deep water fishing and all that kind of stuff. So I think it's a matter of scale. Yes, there was interaction, there was moving around, but not international in terms that we would understand it now. And I suppose to go back to Sarah's point, one other thing we should be looking at is the chronology of shell middens, because there are a lot of 4th, 3rd, 2nd millennium BC and much later shell middens. Let's get a proper chronology for these and let's try and understand what's happening. Because there's this whole question of, okay, what Julian was saying about farming, cereal growing, may well have become difficult. So people may well have then either gone back to or started afresh, exploiting other things. We can see it in Sheridan, where the isotope work on the Sunbrook individuals has suggested that they were trying very hard not to eat fish, but it was so hard to make a living in Sheridan that in times of famine they would eat fish.
Perhaps I can now make a comment as an outsider, because as it happens, 50 years ago I moved from Kenya, as we called it then, to England, and my first interest in archaeology started at that period. And I remember, and this is why I bring it up here, going to see the tribes in the area and wondering which were Neolithic, which were Bronze Age, which were Iron Age. Particularly, this was the time of the Mau Mau and of the White Highlands, the Best Land, the Kikuyu and so on, and also the tribe that most fascinated me and many people today, the Maasai, watching the bleeding of cattle as well as milking of them and wondering what stage they were. And the British, of course, knew the Romans coming in and taking over. But it was in this context, and I should say, I remember the discovery was in Jantrobus by Leakey at that time, and I was actually in at school with one of his boys at Nairobi Primary School for a time. So this is my sort of melting pot. Later on I became a Romanist for my sins and moved on beyond there. Put it right up my mouth, sorry. And also, as it happened 50 years ago, I first went to Stonehenge to see the last of the excavations of that period. And I've been told to cut it down. That's the background. But my real point of making this intervention is this new material, which I follow with great interest, seems now to need to go into the context of climate change, of landscape, of things like how was the Rhine, that vast river, changing at this time, the lower sea level and all the rest of it. And I notice when I see the interesting models, the Weald of Kent, the Great and Sussex and so on, is not there. What is the actual landscape on which all of this is taking place in England at the end of the Mesolithic? We've got so much further into this, it seems to me you now need to fit this into the landscape context and the climate context, which is now so obviously relevant to this very day.
Climate change, comments?
Okay, well, that was on the, if I had more time, I made some notes at the end about sea levels and what we've lost to sea levels, especially in the south and southeast of the country. Climate, I mean, it has been suggested, various proponents, climate facilitates, climate pushes. Trouble is, so far, that it pays you money, you take your choice really, because to my mind there isn't sufficient chronological precision. And a colleague, German colleague, for example, is very keen on climate-driven change or climate-encouraged change. Sometimes he's saying, well, it's a wet phase that makes the change, or well, no, actually there was a time lag after the wet phases, and then we see the change coming, 150 years later. But it was really that climate episode that kicked it all off. Wouldn't argue myself that climate change couldn't encourage change. It might have been the trigger for particular alterations. Not impossible, but I think we need to get a lot more precision in the data, otherwise it gets rather sort of fuzzy, rather deterministic and non-human kind of narrative.
Anyway, do either of the other two want to comment on sea level change? We can take another question for one if anybody wants to. One at the back, and I'll just run to get to it. Sorry.
Thanks, John Lindsay. I think it's a continuation of the last question, really, because if you start off at Shrewsbury Ness and sort of move around to roughly Ipswich, and then you walk through Basildon along the past Hampstead up towards Oxford, and it takes a few days to do the walk, but the whole area at the moment is fantastically wet. It wasn't wet like that a few weeks ago. And the level of precision that you need to be able to say something about what sort of things you can actually grow and do in that sort of environment seems to me to need much more sharpness to the particularity of place. And as you move along the North Downs, there's a bed of sand in one place, which all the water comes out of, forming the River Wandle, which is now an absolute drowning zone, where it's dry for quite large parts of the year. Move slightly further over, and you've got the green sand, which is a stone and not a sand. So what sort of level of precision and detail do you need to be able to jump to the higher level beauties of being able to build long barrows?
I think perhaps one way of addressing that is to say that rather than thinking that people are being driven to do certain things by climate and by the oscillations of various kinds of climatic cycles, that climate, environment, all of these things allow a certain set of possibilities. So we could talk about a geographical possibilism. And then we might talk in terms of your flooding and so on about the range of possibilities that are available in a landscape in a particular period of time. And certainly one of the things that I think is really important for the debate that we're having here is the way in which people learn to operate within landscapes. How variable are those landscapes? How long does it take to learn the cycles of those landscapes, the parameters of those landscapes, and how long does it then take you to get to grips with that landscape and to use it either for hunting and gathering, or for grazing animals, or for growing crops. And those are some of the things which I really think are quite useful
in moving forward in all these kinds of issues, rather than saying, it gets wet at a certain time, well, they must change.
How long does it take to realise that there's a source of jade-like axes in Cumberland?
Too long. It took 17 years of systematic prospecting by the Petricans in the valleys of the around Monfisa and Beloir to find the sources, but they did. And it's only by doing this fantastically systematic survey that you will get that level of detail. So the amount of detail with which they can describe the production, the circulation, the distribution, the use, the deposition of alpine axe heads is a testament to a heck of a lot of hard work. I think on the environment and climate side, you can say that it was slightly warmer then than it is now, so it would have been fairly good for growing crops at that time. And also because of advances in palynology, they're able now to get very fine-grained, site-specific pollen reconstructions of what the environment was like. So they know that you need to take your pollen sample from within about half a kilometre of the site that you're interested in. And if you're lucky enough to do that, then they can understand how far pollen from a field is going to travel if it's heavily forested or lightly forested. So the technology of pollen analysis and climate reconstruction is improving all the time. So I'm sure there will come a point when you can have very, very detailed reconstructions of what was happening where and when.
Right, well, I think we ought to be bringing this to an end. We've given our three speakers a grueling. I'm very grateful to them indeed for the efforts that they've put into preparing this debate for us. I've certainly learned a lot, and I think the audience participation has shown the appreciation that you've all felt as a result of their hard work and efforts. Whether I personally understand the Neolithic any better, I'm not sure. If that applies to any of the rest of you, it does just give me the opportunity to draw attention to the Prehistoric Society's Europa Conference held at the end of May in Cardiff. This is the one that's in honour of Alasdair Whittle and its people, place and time in Neolithic and Chalcolithic Europe. So thank you all three very much indeed, and thank you for coming.